All right, so the blade is hand sanded up to 320, and that's absolutely overdoing it, like by 100% for sure. But I did this for a reason. It's kind of an experiment for me. Um, there is the thing about, what is it, stress risers, essentially like the ridges in the file marks giving a place for a crack to form in the steel when the quench happens. I've never had that happen ever, even when like quenching things that had a grinds of 36 grit. But with as much work as I put into this as far as filing, that's not something I'm willing to chance. So that's why I, went to 120 on the sandpaper. But I took it to 320 because the thing that I want to find out is, did I save myself time with hand sanding? So obviously it's a lot easier to hand sand unhardened steel than it is hardened steel. And so after this is quenched, my hope is that there won't be a whole lot of scale, and I should be able to start at 320 to get the remaining scale off. And we can, if it doesn't work, I'll try and put it in the vinegar bath again, see if I can get that scale off, and then go from there. So that's my hope. I haven't done this before, so we'll see how that works out. I may have taken this to 320 for no reason, but that's all right. I mean, this is how we learn these things, so we'll see what happens. We're going to first normalize the blade, and so I wanted to talk about that. So because we forged this, we took it to high temperatures and then smashed it. So the higher the temperature that you take steel, the more or the bigger the grain becomes. The more room the molecules have to move around. And so big grain equals bad, essentially. We want the smallest grain possible, and that's going to give this the best edge retention and durability that we can get out of the steel. The best performance really is what that comes down to. And ADCR-V2 is really nice because it has what's called vanadium, and that actually promotes a tighter grain structure than a lot of other knives. So not normalizing it after having forged it is kind of a waste, and you're producing a way lower quality knife. Now, here's a little bit of the tricky part. Normalizing out of the forge, unless you're really familiar with the colors, the color of the steel versus the actual temp that it's at, this is going to be a little bit difficult to get right. So what I'm going to do is, over there my heat treat oven is on, it's warming up. We're going to do the first normalizing cycle in the heat treat oven at 1500, because we're going to do the way that I normalize ADCR-V2 is I do 3 normalizing cycles at 1500. So essentially I take my heat treat oven to 1500 degrees, let this soak for about 10 minutes. I take it out, I'll set it down, or typically I'll clamp it in a vise upright, and I'll let it cool down to room temperature, and then I'll do that again, and then I'll do it a third time. And what that's doing is it's shrinking that grain, and then it's holding that grain where it is. I heat it back up to 1500, it shrinks that grain a little more, holds it. Once it goes to room temperature, shrink that grain again on that third time, and it's good, right? And then after that, we do the quench. So 3 normalizing cycles, heat it back up, and then you do the quench. Now, the reason why I'm going to do the first cycle in the heat treat oven is so that you guys can see what the color should look like around 1500 degrees. So as you are taking it in and out of your forge, and we'll go over how to properly paint the knife with the heat and get the even heat throughout the blade in the forge when we do the quench. But for that first normalizing cycle, see the color that it should look like, so you have some sort of reference if you're kind of new. All right, let's get to that. All right, so I closed my garage doors. I turned off the lights. There's still some light in here, but you want your garage as dark as possible so that you can actually see the true color of the steel. So I'm gonna grab it out of the heat treat oven, and then I'm gonna go ahead and throw it in my leg vise vertical so that it can cool down to room temperature. But I'm gonna bring the knife close up to the camera so you guys can see the color that it should be when we start taking it out of the forge. So you can see it's a pretty dull orange. That's what we're gonna try to shoot for out of the forge. And you can already see that the edge like cooled pretty quickly, right? So that's a good, I guess, example of why you would need to quench this extremely fast out of the forge or out of your heat treat oven. All right, so I'm gonna put it in the leg vise, let it cool to room temp, and then we'll start normalizing it out of the forge. All right, I did want to cover something. There's a reason why I put it in my leg vise vertically, and that's because if you lay it flat on your anvil, or flat on anything really, it's gonna, that whatever surface you put it on, whether it's the floor or whatnot, like it's gonna act as a heat sink. So it's gonna draw that heat out of the knife from one side. So it's gonna technically be cooling unevenly. And I've noticed a lot of the times when I do that on the forge, or on the anvil rather, it pulls to the side that's cooling fastest. So actually, my blade ends up warping just from trying to cool it down. You do that 3 times and you have like a decent warp. So it took me a little bit to figure out that if I just do it vertically, that doesn't happen. So having it warp at all during normalization is not a thing anymore. So that's why I do that. All right, so whenever I do this, I always stick the tang in first. I'm always edge down because the edge is a lot thinner than the spine, so it's gonna heat up a lot quicker. And so what I don't wanna do is in attempting to heat the spine up to 1500 degrees, end up taking the edge way higher than that. Because that's obviously the most important part of the knife when it comes to that grain structure. So what I'm doing right now is I'm gonna be heating the tang, which isn't too, like, even if the grain is, bigger than the blade grain size, that's not too big of a deal because obviously we're not really relying on the edge or the handle to hold an edge. So what I'm doing is I'm just preheating the All right, so now we're gonna quench the blade. We're gonna heat up the blade for the quench the same exact way as we did with the normalizing. We're gonna heat up the tang first so it doesn't act like a heat sink. Then we're gonna turn it around. We're gonna put the blade in, edge down, and then we're going to paint the blade back and forth to get that even heat. Once we get back up to that color that we were at from before, we're gonna test the blade on this magnet right here. Now, and let me give you a closer look. It's just a welding square magnet or whatever. I can't remember what it's actually called, but it's for welding, but it's a magnet. So the reason why we do this is when steel is at its critical temperature, or when you're able to take it from pearlite to martensite, that's when it becomes non-magnetic. And that's what we're looking for. We're gonna take that blade out once it's at that orange color. We're going to touch it on this magnet, and if it doesn't stick to the magnet, we know we're at the right temperature to quench. We're gonna stick the blade back in, edge down still, paint it back and forth for about a minute to get that even heat, because as we take it out, it's losing heat, right? So we don't wanna quench it right after we test it. We'll stick it back in, get it back up to temp, let it soak so it has that even heat. We're gonna take it out and quench it right away. All right, so the quench media that I'm using is AAA. That's an oil that you can buy from a lot of knife making websites. I'll put links in the description, but you don't need it. That's what ADCR V2 is recommended to quench with, right? You'll get the most performance if you're using the right quench media. But what you can do is, if you obviously we're trying to do this on a budget, you can use peanut oil, and that'll work just fine. You'll get plenty of performance out of the steel. I've done it many times myself. So, and it doesn't have to be in a big ass ammo can like this. It could be in a small ammo can, or something that obviously can hold hot ass oil, not disintegrate. So with that, I like doing a vertical quench, because that, at least for me, prevents me from hitting the tip or the edge or something on the bottom of the can, if it's a smaller can or something like that, and unintentionally warping my blade. So as I quench, I'm only going to count to 10. I'm going to count to 10 and do what's called an interrupted quench. I'm going to take it out prior to it being fully hardened, and it's going to be smoking a lot. That's a good thing, because I'm going to have 30 seconds to straighten out any sort of warp that may have happened during the quench. I'm going to use my leg vise in order to straighten out the blade, but I've seen Greg from GC Knives actually just use a thick-ass welding glove and straighten it by hand. If you have the right equipment, you can do that, like the proper safety equipment. You don't want to grab a blade when it's that hot with your bare hands, or even like a mechanic's glove. Not a fucking good idea. So I'm going to use my leg vise because I don't have welding gloves that thick. All right, so let's do that. And I definitely ran out of time because this happened, which is a bummer. So we lost about 3/4 of an inch of the knife. But stuff like that happens. Knife makers don't make mistakes, they just make smaller knives, right? So what we're gonna end up doing is I'm gonna end up reprofiling this and bringing this up to this point right here. So a little bit of a bummer, but this gives us a good opportunity to look at the grain structure of this little hunter. And we'll get a good idea of whether or not we did a good job with our normalizing cycles. So what we want to see is something that looks just like a solid gray mass in the center. If it looks like grainy at all, if it looks like sand or anything like that, that is a bad thing. So if it's a solid gray mass and it doesn't look like there's any pores or anything like that, it looks like this, like it's a part of the steel like that, that's a really good thing, because that means that those grains became extremely tight, and you can't see the space in between them. So let's check it out. But look at that grain structure though. That's exactly what we want to see. Nice and tight. Can't visibly see the grains themselves. So actually coming out of the forge, that's pretty damn good. So that's exactly what we want to see, and that's a good sign as far as the rest of the knife, because the thing is like I was saying while we were getting ready to quench it, the tip is the thing that heats up the most and heats up the fastest. So especially when it's that thin. So the fact that has, or this portion has such tight grain structure means that definitely is the case down in here, all throughout the rest of the blade. So yeah, that's exactly what we want to see. And although it is a bummer, that we lost some length, stuff like this does happen. Knife makers don't make mistakes, they just make smaller knives, so let's make a smaller knife. All right, so here is the new profile now after having spent a lot more time filing. If this does happen to you, the draw filing method is what's going to be your best friend, because it's an absolute fucking pain in the ass to file hardened steel. So, but it can be done. So this is where we're at now. I kind of like this look a lot better, actually. This kind of strikes me more as a hunter than what we had from before. What we had from before was more of like bordering on a fighter, just because the length of the blade was so long, and that, you know, upward curving spine, you know, or that upward curving swedge. So I like this. This feels more hunterish. So not a bad day, and we found out the grain structure in here is legit. So this is definitely going to be a good knife, good for actual use. Yeah, so now we're going to go back to hand sanding. We'll go back to hand sanding after we temper it, because right now the knife is extremely brittle, as we saw when we broke the tip of the knife off. The harder it gets, the more brittle it is, so we're going to draw back that hardness a bit with tempering. And so what tempering is essentially putting it in an oven and taking it up to, for in our case, 350 degrees. So 350 degrees for 2 hours. And this is what I recommend. You don't have to have a toaster oven. You can do this in your house oven, you know, if your wife doesn't kill you when you do this. But here's what I recommend is you 100% need to order one of these. This is another thing not to skimp on. These are really cheap. I think this one was like only like $7 or something like that. But your toaster ovens and even your indoor oven, like your house oven, they're not very accurate, but these are really accurate. So what I do is, actually I've learned that I have to put this a little over 400 to get the actual temperature in here to 350. So just be cognizant of that, and just understand that, you know, the oven that you have in your house or your garage is not very accurate, so you got to get one of those. And you can find that on Amazon as well. That's where I got mine. But yeah, so we're gonna temper this at 350 for 2 hours. We're gonna take it out. Typically, this is when you can leave it on your anvil. I'll leave it on my anvil and let it go down to room temp, and then I temper it again a second time at 400 degrees for 2 hours, and then it's ready for the finishing. So we can go back to hand sanding, get the blade how we want it, and then move on to the handle.